Our next topic is one that I think a lot of people have interest in. Some are totally against it, and there's obviously some for it. But ag preservation, we do have Lancaster Farmland Trust here in Jebb, Musser, and then we also have Matt Knepper from the Lancaster County Ag Preserve Board. I did invite all the ag boards here. Jeff Shillington from Chester County. Every county does have its own preservation board, and for overall they are similar, but there is some differences between the counties. That's where, again, a good realtor, a good auctioneer that knows these people can explain the differences. But I'm going to let them talk, and then I got usually a whole bunch of stuff to add to it. But start off with Jebb from Lancaster Farmland Trust.
Morning, everyone. Thanks, Chris. Jebb Musser from Lancaster Farmland Trust. Over in the corner there, I'm joined by my colleague Laura Hershey. She's also with Lancaster Farmland Trust, and then we have Matt and Kevin from the County Ag Preserve Board. So Matt's gonna, like Chris said, Matt will be up here in a little bit, but feel free to come over and chat with us throughout the meeting, and we can answer any specific questions you might have. So in Lancaster County, at least, Chris mentioned each county is a little bit different, but in Lancaster County, there are two primary options for someone who wants to preserve their farm. There's the Lancaster County Ag Preserve Board, so county government program, and then there's a private option. That's who I'm with Lancaster Farmland Trust. We are a nonprofit organization. We're what's called a land trust. And our mission, which is up on your screen, is to vigorously accelerate the permanent protection and stewardship of farmland in Lancaster County. Move forward there. So the two main, when most folks think of Lancaster Farmland Trust, obviously they're thinking of farmland preservation, and that is at our core the work that we do. But we also focus more and more on what we call conservation work, and conservation is one of those words that takes a lot of different definitions. But what we're talking about there would be like soil health, water quality, those sort of things. So we were founded in 1988. We're about 40 years old. We are a 15-member staff, 18-member board. Chris was on our board in the past. Our board consists of members from the ag community, so a couple of farmers, folks from ag lending, realtors, attorneys, sort of a mix of folks working in ag. Move forward. So farmland preservation. So what farmland preservation means, at least in our context, is a landowner would grant what's called a conservation easement on their farm. So this is a permanent restriction that would be attached to the deed of your property or the title of your property that would limit what the property can and can't be used for in the future. So you are not granting any sort of ownership of the property to either organization. You still own the property, manage the property, transfer the property to future owners, those sort of things. Basically all with this restriction attached to it. Just like you would if you had another easement on your property. Think about if you have power lines running across your property, or a sewer line, or maybe your neighbor's got a driveway easement across your property. A lot of those easements are in perpetuity for certain defined purposes, like running power lines across a property. What you're doing with us is you're granting us an easement to protect certain conservation values of your farm. So, and I see a couple of preserve farmers in the room, so make sure you at least come over and say hi. So at least with our program, our easement, conservation easement, has 5 main objectives. So obviously we're looking at protecting the ag values of a property. That should be somewhat obvious. So ag soils, and sort of open space available for farming, those sort of things. But also some other things that you might not think about that are important when it comes to farmland preservation, things like scenic views from public rights of way, water quality, biological resources, ecosystem type of resources. If we have a 100-acre farm that has some ag buildings on it but isn't developed into warehouses or other sort of things, then you have the ability to have that ground then infiltrate rainwater and those sort of things, and it helps the groundwater recharge and mitigate runoff and flooding and those sort of things. So yes, we're preserving farmland, but farmland has a lot of other conservation values that might not be as obvious to the general public. So when a farm is preserved, like I said, it's restricted to certain types of uses, but there still is, and this is oftentimes sort of where some confusion comes into play. it's not preserved exactly. It doesn't necessarily need to stay preserved exactly the way it is the day that you sign the paperwork. We allow for a wide variety of agricultural uses. So if your farm's currently a dairy, but your kids take over and they want to do produce or Christmas trees or some other sort of different types of use, there are a wide variety of agricultural uses are permitted in our program, in both programs. In addition to ag, we also typically allow for, sorry, you can advance the slide. I'm on the next slide here. You can advance, or you can have some other types of uses that might be supportive of agriculture. So a sideline business, for example. So ag still has to be the primary use of the property, but if you got a welding shop on it or, some other sort of support business that, maybe dad's running that business while the kids are farming or vice versa, that's acceptable. And there's a whole lot of sort of fine detail that we could get into with both programs on what types of businesses might be permitted at what scale, in what locations, but sort of the takeaway is that oftentimes these sideline businesses are permitted. In our case, these sideline businesses have to be in certain areas of the property that we would work with you sort of at the onset of preservation, set aside an area where you could have a little bit more flexibility about what you could do within that area. Other uses, so residential uses, so obviously you don't want somewhere to live on the farm, and a lot of times there's a farmstead that already exists at the time of preservation, but we do limit the total number of houses on a property. Usually our rule of thumb is one house per 25 acres. Now, if you have a 200-acre farm, we might start having some conversations about scaling that back a little bit, but let's say you have a 75-acre farm and you had one house out there. Oftentimes in our program we'll allow for 2 additional houses in the future. And those could be subdivided. Typically it's a 1-acre lot that you can subdivide an additional house on until you reach the 60, 65 and up acre mark. Then we start allowing for an ag subdivision. So if you have an 80-acre farm with one house on it, a lot of times we would let you split that into 2 40-acre farms in the future. So, there's a little bit of, as opposed to, and Matt can touch on that. So you have sort of some pros and cons to both programs. With our program, there's a little bit of flexibility about things that you can negotiate into our easement because, while we operate off of a template, we're not governed by sort of state law on what we can and can't do. We have our own set of policies. But we have rules of thumb that we like to follow, and we certainly want to make sure we're still achieving some conservation value when we preserve a piece of land. So subdivisions, and again, something to keep in mind is even the Lancaster Farmland Trust might say, hey, in our easement document, we say on your 80-acre farm that you can have one ag subdivision of 10 or more acres and build a house on it. Even though we say that, your local township might not say that. Their set of zoning rules might be different than that. So that's always something to keep in mind too is, there are those sort of different sets of restrictions that different entities might hold on your property, and the township being one of them. But preservation is permanent. Zoning is in place for a period of time, and it could change. They could change their zoning ordinance in 50 years from now, and that might say something different. So those are sort of the key things to keep in mind. With our program, we do place a limit on impervious surface coverage. So think about building footprints, driveways, barnyards, those sort of things. We all count as impervious surface. And again, typically we set aside an area of the property where there is no limit on impervious. Usually it's a 5 or 8 acre area where you can have a lot of flexibility where the house is at, where the main cluster of buildings are at, where there's no limit on that impervious surface. And then out in the ag land is usually where we place a limitation, typically 2% of that area. So that's a key difference between the two programs, is the county program does not have an impervious surface limitation. And then 3 different protection areas. You may have a wooded tract on your property where you want the ability to maybe not have it converted to agriculture, but you want the ability to maybe timber it in the future. We could place that in a different type of protection area where, we would spell out that you can't farm this area for traditional farming, but you can do some selective timbering and those sort of things in those areas. So, next slide. So on the financial side, with our program, I always like to spell out that there basically are 3 main options when you work with us. The first one is a full easement donation. So not as common, but if we do 20 farms a year, maybe 1 or 2 of those may end up being a full easement donation. What that means is you would not be paid anything for the preservation of your farm. Rather, you would fully donate that easement or those development rights, to put another way, and you would be able to use that full amount that you donated in the form of a development right value towards a federal income tax deduction, which can be spread out over a 15-year period of time. So we're working on sort of maybe refining what the current average value of development rights or easement value in Lancaster County is, but let's say it's around $4,000 an acre, which is what it has been the past number of years. So if you have a 100-acre farm, $4,000 per acre, it could be a $400,000 donated easement value that you could take a tax deduction for over that 15-year period of time. The important thing to keep in mind there is it is a deduction, not a credit. So that's one option. Bargain sale, traditional sort of bargain sale payment for an easement is what most folks work through in our program. This would be, we're paying you, but we're paying you something less than what it's actually worth. So if using that $4,000 per acre appraised easement value example, our top payment is $2,000 per acre. So in most cases, the most we're ever going to pay, at least with our current payment structure, is 50% of appraised easement value in most cases. We base our scoring system, we base what we pay off of a scoring system that looks at different criteria of your farm, size, stream frontage, road frontage, percent of class 1, 2, 3, 4 soils, those sort of things. Score that out of 100, and that equates to a payment range to try to keep it sort of objective for when comparing farm to farm. And anything you're not paid for is still eligible for that tax deduction that I referenced. So a lot of folks are getting paid some, but then also taking some for a tax deduction. And then last option with us is also a bargain sale option. However, it involves using federal funding. So Lancaster Farmland Trust can go get a federal grant from USDA through their Ag Land Easements program. And they will usually contribute 50% of the appraised easement value. And then Lancaster Farmland Trust will typically kick on an additional amount, usually anywhere between $300 to $600 per acre on top of that. So it's a way to get paid, but get paid a little bit more than what you ordinarily would get paid in our program. But in that scenario, you got to be comfortable with the federal funding programs, a little bit of a longer wait period because it just takes a little longer to work through those programs, and some slightly different set of restrictions. Move forward. So preservation process. So initial phase, we can have as many meetings as anyone wanted to have. Kitchen table meetings talking about the preservation process. A lot of times we'll do meetings with our staff and the Ag Preserve Board staff. We have some handouts, I believe, over there that compare the two programs that can sort of hits the high level points and how they differ. So meetings to discuss options. We would obviously score the farm in our scoring system to give you an idea of how much we could pay you if you're looking for a payment. We'd have you sign a letter of intent, which basically tells our board that you're interested enough to have them look at it. And then our land protection committee and our board would review the farm for preservation. Most times farms, sort of your typical farm in Lancaster County, is not much of a discussion, I would say, by our board. It's, if it fits our criteria, we're going to approve it. It's farms that might be a little smaller, under 10 acres, or maybe in an area where there's a lot of maybe it's a farm maybe it's a property that's 90 acres, but maybe only 15 acres of ag land or something like that. Sort of a unique property is where they might have a little bit of a different stance on it. But most times, by the time staff's bringing a farm to our board, we know whether or not they're going to be okay with it. So the board approves it, assuming we have funding to move forward at that time. We go through a due diligence phase, survey, title work, appraisal. We are drafting the easement, having a chance for you to review it with your attorney or other sort of advisors if you choose to. Working with your banker. So we work with Dale and Univest a lot. So if you have a mortgage on your property, the mortgage predates the easement. The mortgage the lender has to subordinate to our easement, basically indicating that they're not going to challenge the validity of our easement in the event that you would default on your loan. So it's not really a typical type of subordination agreement, but it's basically a consent agreement that says they're aware the farm's being preserved, but they're not going to challenge it if there end up being issues with your loan. And then we have settlement. And then once it's preserved, it is preserved in perpetuity. There used to be some term easements that existed. So a period of time the farm was preserved for 20 years and then it would term out. Those sort of went by the wayside in the 80s and 90s. So they're all pretty much perpetual easements at this point in time. And our role after that is to enforce and monitor that easement. So that's what you would be entrusting us with in perpetuity, is making sure that the farm stays preserved. So we come out once a year to monitor the farm, do a quick site visit, check in with you, meet with any new landowners if you sell the property, give them a chance to understand what's in the easement. A lot of times at auctions, we try to have somebody there. It's a little potentially too late at that point in time to answer a lot of really detailed questions, but we do try to be there if their questions come up, and certainly available ahead of time if the farm's being put up for sale for buyers to call us and ask questions about the easement restrictions. If I have any more slides or not. And then, our legal duty once the farm is preserved is that enforcement piece. But we recognize that, especially, once the farm transfers 2 or 3 or 4 times, those landowners might say, well, geez, I didn't, I wasn't the one that preserved this farm. I didn't get paid for it. What's in it for me? You guys are just out here checking on me every year. So our organization has really tried to lean in a little bit in the past decade or so on some ways where we can add value beyond just being the folks who are enforcing the easement restrictions to our preserve farm owners, and our conservation program is one of the ways we're able to do that. And we're sort of always keeping our eyes out for other opportunities to maybe help sort of treat our preserve farmers as a VIP club, and that they can tap into LFT's resources and staff for guidance on things and grant programs and those sort of things. So, but our conservation program, so we are assisting our preserve farmers with water quality, soil quality projects. So think about things like manure storage projects, concreting and curbing your barnyard, putting a roof over your barnyard, even like a heifer barn, not the barn part of it, but the roof and the manure storage underneath and those sort of things. A lot of times are fundable projects through some of these conservation related programs that we can tap into on your behalf. Animal trails and walkways, stormwater improvements around the farmstead, planting trees around the stream, animal crossings, all those sort of things are what's called best management practices under the umbrella of NRCS, and are funded through a variety of grant programs. And being a nonprofit, we can have access to those. So that's a way that we've helped a lot of our farmers, make improvements to their property. And I'd say, while we have a waiting list of about 40 farms right now for preservation who are interested in preserving their farms with us, we got about a 60 farm waiting list of our existing preserve farms who want to do these types of conservation projects. So it's been a really nice way to sort of broaden our work that we're able to help you all with. And it makes a lot of sense to tie the two together. The farms that we're investing in as a community to preserve ought to be the ones that are performing at the highest level, environmentally speaking, economically speaking, and those sort of things. All right. I think that's it. Okay. Let Matt come up here.
All right, thanks, Jebb. So as Chris mentioned, I'm Matt Knepper. I'm with the Ag Preserve Board, the Lancaster County Ag Preserve Board, and we do, in a nutshell, the same thing as the Farmland Trust, but there are some key differences and some important differences between our two programs, and I'll highlight those today. Starting off with, first and foremost, we're a public program. So I work for the county commissioners. We run a preservation program that is funded with county money, with state money. It's a state preservation program that's administered at the county level. And so there are other county programs around us. All of our neighboring counties have farmland preservation programs. Berks County, Chester County, York, Adams, all excellent programs. So if you own land or are interested in purchasing a preserve farm or preserving your farm in those locations, you've got great resources there as well. Here in Lancaster, you can talk to me, you can talk to Kevin, who's at the table over there for the rest of the day if you have any questions. I want to point out the map. I know that's going to be small to see at that scale. We have one printed out for you to look at if you're into maps. Starting with that is 40 years of farmland preservation. So what you see on the map is over 125,000 acres of preserved land, nearly 1,700 farms that are preserved permanently, as Jebb said. The darkest green are farms preserved by the County Ag Preserve Board. The yellow are farms preserved by the Lancaster Farmland Trust. That lighter green background color is ag zoning. And the gray you see kind of throughout things are the urban areas, the designated growth areas where we don't preserve farms. And I'll come back to that. So we're a public program. We receive money from the county, from the state, roughly $4.5 to $5 million each year we have to work with. That will preserve 15 to 20 farms, depending on the size of the farm, depending on how expensive things are on each individual farm. The whole process starts with an application. If you are interested in preserving your farm, we have applications at our table. If you're not into preserving your farm, but you might be buying a farm that is preserved, there's a decent chance of that. Over 30% of all of our farms are preserved. Over 30% of all of the ag zoned land in the county is preserved. So the rules and requirements, what it means to have a preserved farm might be important to you even if you're not preserving your own farm. If you do want to preserve your farm, that starts with the application process. A lot of the process is the same as what Jebb went over, so I won't go over everything again. But some of the differences between our programs come down to what we have as fixed rules and non-negotiables, where the Farmland Trust can be a bit more flexible. And that is in the rules of preservation, but also what kind of farms we can preserve in the first place. So we have some very specific criteria that farms have to meet in order to be preserved. Jebb mentioned maybe a less than 10-acre farm. That's something that won't qualify for preservation under the county program. Our hard minimum is 10 acres. Bigger is better in terms of priority and getting your farm preserved sooner than later. Other requirements for soil quality and land use. So the majority of the farm parcel has to be used for farming. At least half of the farm has to be in cropland or pasture land. At least half of the property has to be in good quality soils, classes 1 through 4. And there has to be a conservation plan on the property when that application comes in the door to us. I'll hit that again later. The conservation plan is also a requirement of preserving your farm. It's a requirement of state law anyway, but it's also a component of our easement that you have a conservation plan forever in perpetuity, but we require that right up front when the application comes in the door as well. Referring to this map again, we also require the county looks at these land use designations and land use tools in our program as well. The county requires that your farm is zoned for agriculture and that it's not in one of those designated growth areas in order to be preserved. So we're not trying to preserve a farm that somebody is trying to develop. We're not competing with developers in a borough, in a town, in a neighborhood to try to preserve a farm that's in those areas. We're interested in preserving farms that are in farm country, that are next to other preserved farms. We currently have a list of 150 folks who are interested in preserving their farms, and we don't preserve those farms in order of first come, first serve. So we have a ranking system that determines whose farm is preserved first. That's based on some state requirements. We're also able to adjust those locally as well. But the main things to remember are that the larger farm that's next to another preserved farm that has great quality soils are going to be the highest ranking farms in our system. So if you've got a big farm and your neighbor has preserved their farm, maybe 2 of your neighbors have preserved their farm, there's a good chance that your farm will be a high priority for preservation and go to the top of that list, even if you applied just this year and there are other people on the list that applied 5 years ago. The process, like I mentioned, is very similar to what the Farmland Trust does. It starts with an appraisal. It is a real estate process after all. Some of the key differences here are that the Ag Preserve Board can pay up to $4,000 an acre. That's a cap that's established by the Ag Preserve Board. But even if we wanted to pay more, we're still limited by the appraised value. So when a farm is preserved, there's an appraisal done to determine the value of the rights you're giving up. we can never pay more than what that appraisal would say anyway. So our cap is $4,000 an acre. Last year, our average payment was just under $3,700 an acre for all of the farms we preserved. The average appraisal was around $4,700 an acre. So it's still common for us to not pay the full value when preserving a farm, but that is an option with our program, where it's not typically an option, or it's not an option with the Farmland Trust. The whole process for us, it can vary timing-wise. Best case scenario, if we're working with county money that doesn't require additional state approvals, if the landowner or landowners are making decisions quickly, if there's not a survey required, if that title process is a little faster, we might be able to get it done in 6 months. It's likely going to take the better part of a year, potentially more than a year, if things are slow to happen. If there's a survey required, if there are complicated title issues to resolve, if there are multiple people making decisions in the landowner side of things, and if there's state funding, that state process does require additional time. So it may take more than a year, and that's when we start the process. That doesn't count just from when you applied to our program. Similar to the Farmland Trust, our easement is permanent. There were term easements back in the 80s, like Jebb mentioned. Those are not, we don't do those anymore. We found they weren't meeting our goals, and honestly, all of those were converted, all but a portion of one, were converted into permanent easements eventually anyway. But when you preserve your farm with a county, there are some very similar requirements to the Farmland Trust. There are limits on subdivision, limits on non-agricultural development, non-agricultural construction. But where some of the differences are is that we can't negotiate those things like the Farmland Trust can. The trust might be able to allow 2 houses to be built on the farm after it's preserved. In our program, every farm is limited to 1 more house that may be built after the farm is preserved. Our subdivision rules are the same for every farm as well. A number of years ago, the Ag Preserve Board tightened up the subdivision rules, and it's now required to have a 150-acre farm in order to divide that into a smaller farm. So 75 acres is the minimum farm size after the farm is preserved. It can't be made any smaller than that. And that's not a negotiable thing with us, where the Farmland Trust has more flexibility there to plan out future subdivisions after the farm is preserved. What that means is there's more planning needed up front before you preserve the farm with the county. So if you have a 100-acre farm and you really want the ability to divide that into 2 50-acre farms in the future, it might need to be preserved as 2 50-acre farms instead of preserved as 1 100-acre farm. And the same with number of dwellings. If you really need to have more than 1 additional house after the farm is preserved, that's a discussion we need to have ahead of time and plan for that ahead of time, and maybe not preserve 2 acres of the farm so you can build another house there, because after the farm is preserved, you're only allowed to build 1 more house. Other things like Jebb mentioned, rights of ways and easements. Those are generally not permitted after the farm is preserved. So if your neighbor wants to, build a driveway across part of your farm to get to their garage, that's not going to be allowed after the farm is preserved. So we need to look at all of those things before and hopefully make arrangements for those. Other things like side businesses that the Farmland Trust allows, the Ag Preserve Board also allows, and this runs the spectrum from real traditional things like wood shops and weld shops to solar panels. So solar panels to generate electricity for use on the farm, that's permitted on a preserved farm, but it's limited in size. We're not permitting utility scale solar where the entire farm is covered with panels, but there is some permission for solar panels. Digesters, manure digesters, they're permitted, again, with certain limitations. One of the hot items more recently is agritourism, and having folks come onto your farm to experience your farm and perhaps have a meal or stay overnight. Those things may be permitted as well, again, with certain limitations. I can probably leave it there. Chris, I don't know if I hit everything you wanted me to cover. I know we talked about some numbers earlier this morning.
I think you got most of it. The big thing I'd like to point out again, they're giving you the $5,000 or 5,000 foot view for Lancaster County. We'll say Lancaster Farmland Trust actually has expanded out. We've done some in Fulton, we've done some in Cumberland County. So it isn't just restricted to Lancaster County, so I want to let that part out. But the big thing is, talk about these different entities. Like we said, every county, most of them, all of them, I think, have their quote ag preservation, but there's a few that don't have any board. So we're fortunate enough to have a board that is active and so forth. But I can give you the 50,000 foot view because with our group of guys, a couple more guys just came in from Perry County and Northumberland County, as we deal with all kinds of these different outfits all over the state. And we are in Maryland and Pennsylvania, so I'm familiar with both sides of the line. And I don't know if this number held out, maybe you guys know, but the last time I kept track, there's actually 68 private, nonprofit Pennsylvania land trust groups out there. Does your realtor or auctioneer know the ins and outs of all of them? Again, we're spread out. We're dealing with a lot of these different entities, so we're familiar with them. And I can go through. So obviously, there's actually federal. Sometimes these guys will get federal money. They're even more restrictive yet, but it's an option. So we do have federal funds. We have state funds. We have county funds. Actually, some of our townships also are now preserving farms. So not all of them, but there is certain townships out there in Chester and Lancaster County, and I'm not sure about Berks or Lebanon, but there is townships actually putting up money now to preserve farms. We got the Nature Conservancy, Natural Lands Trust, Brandywine Conservancy, Octorara Watershed Association, the Cecil Land Trust in Maryland. We got MALF, which is the Maryland State one, Lancaster County Conservancy, Berks County Conservancy, the list goes on. So are you familiar with what each of them have to offer? And as Lancaster Farmland Trust and the Lancaster County Ag Board do work together sometimes, there is a lot of these other ones that can be also combined. Chester County Ag Preservation, to make their money go farther, is working with the Brandywine Conservancy quite a bit. And basically Brandywine is preserving the wooded sections of the farm, and the Chester County Ag Board is preserving, quote, the tillable and pasture areas. But there's pluses and minuses to all these different groups. So again, you want an advisor that can help you through the process and think about what your long-term goals are in preserving these farms. So, but they do work together. The proceeds, again, I mentioned earlier, but you can do a 1031 exchange with any of your ag preservation proceeds. So if you're looking to buy another farm, that's great, or another property. It doesn't even have to be a farm. It can be just a vacation home, whatever you want to do with it. Can't be your primary residence, but it can be a 1031 exchange into another type property. The other thing that I would like to point out, we talked about value. I'm a realtor, I'm an auctioneer, so everybody thinks I get all the bargains or whatever like that, but on real estate, that isn't true. But at the end of the day, I preserve my own farm. So if I thought it was devaluing, that would make me look kind of like a dummy. But I preserve my own farm. I've got a couple tracts actually that are preserved. So there is benefits. We talked about the tax implications, and we'll get more into this with some of the other speakers. But you are allowed to donate up to 35%. If I don't know if I think that's still the same, but you're allowed to donate up to 35% of your annual income to charitable organizations. And so therefore, even if you donated an easement, I'm just going to use simple math here. If you made $100,000 a year, you can use $35,000 in charitable donations every year, times whatever your effective tax rate is, and that's how much money you're saving in taxes. So there is pluses even to donating easements. I've had people say, I didn't even really think about donating, but I'm ready to sell. I got to sell, whatever. So we donated the full easement to offset capital gains. This is the flip side. Now you can offset 100% of your capital gains in the initial sale. So again, if you got a $400,000, well, $4,700 appraisal, that's $470,000 on a 100-acre farm that we just sold for $3 million. I'm just using numbers. So we can take $470,000 right off the top of that against your capital gains. Reduce that basis down from $3 million down to $2,530,000. So it's still saving you some serious capital gains taxes as well. And then the other one is just some people talk about deed restrictions. You hear a lot about deed restrictions, and these are deed restrictions in a sense going against your property, but I'll use my own family as an example. We preserved our farm, let me rephrase that. We deed restricted our farm before there was any ag preservation available, before these entities ever came out. So we did not want to see our farm get developed, and I say this is my parents. I was only 15 when we sold. And so they put a deed restriction in that said it never could be subdivided. Well, years later, the fellow that bought it came to my mom and dad and said, hey, I really want to split this farm to put a second farm on for my children. And they dug their heels in and said no. Here's the downside of a deed restriction. Who has to enforce it?
You do.
Yeah, we, the landowner, the private owners, have to enforce that. Everybody thinks you put a deed restriction in, you're good, you're safe. And no, the reality is the township's not going to police it. You can't go call the township and say, hey, that guy just broke my deed restriction. They don't care. They're going to go by their zoning. So private deed restrictions can work, but you ultimately are the one that has to enforce it, or your neighbors. And guess what that entails? You hiring an attorney, you trying to enforce your own deed restriction that you put in place. The nice thing is with these entities like the county, Lanc Farmland Trust, whoever, they take over that responsibility. So it accomplished your goal for whatever you want, and you never have to worry about it again. They defend it. So, and you can negotiate with them. They don't like me saying this probably, but you can negotiate with them on certain things, certain aspects. I'll let them take those answers and questions. Some have a little more flexibility than others. But when I say that, impervious surface coverage limits, stuff like that. So you want to know what your long-term plan is, because the last thing you want to do is go with a federal easement that only allows you, what, 2%?
Yeah.
I think 2% impervious surface coverage, because guess what? You're not going to get too many chicken houses up on that. So yeah, you want to know what you're dealing with. So I think with that, I think there's usually a lot of interest, a lot of questions on this. I think we'll save those questions to the end, or you obviously can go talk to these folks while they're here. And we'll just go ahead. Elvin, you want to?
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jeff.